Hello and a warm welcome to episode 109 of the Building Sustainability podcast. I'm Jeffrey Hart, and every fortnight join me as I talk to designers, builders, makers, dreamers and doers. Together we can explore the wide world of sustainability in the built environment by talking to wonderful people who are doing excellent things. And today's wonderful person is Mathew Barnett Howland. He's Director of Research and Development at CSK Architects in Eton and also Associate Professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. Alongside Dido Milne and Oliver Wilton, he created Cork House, in which we recorded this conversation. And the episode is all about Cork House. So what is Cork House? From Matthew's website, Cork House is a brand new and radically simple form of plant-based construction. Monolithic walls and corbelled roofs are made almost entirely from solid, load-bearing cork. This highly innovative self-build construction kit is designed for disassembly, is carbon negative at completion, and has an exceptionally low whole life carbon. And the awards list for Cork House is quite something. Architects Journal House of the Year 2019, the REBA Stephen Lawrence Prize 2019, the REBA President's Award for Research 2019. It was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, the American Institute for Architects International Regional Design Awards 2020, received an Honour Award for Architecture and Sustainable Future Award. Architecture Master Prize 2020, Best of Best in Green Architecture. It got the REBA National Award in 2019. It got the Wood Awards 2019 Gold Award. Structural Timber Awards 2020. It was the Private Housing Project of the Year. It was the Sunday Times British Home Awards 2019 Small House of the Year. And a whole load more others. So stay tuned for this fantastic conversation that was so in-depth that I've had to split it over 2 episodes. So before we get into the episode, there is the usual bits and bobs. Starting with, there is a free exhibition at the Design Museum in London called How to Build a Low Carbon Home. How can we design our homes to respond to climate emergency? Discover how architects are reimagining wood, stone and straw to design homes fit for the future. So that features friends of the podcast, Material Cultures, a whole load of exhibitions, scale models, photographs, tools and samples that you can see the real life materials. So head on over to that if you are in the London area. There is a reminder that our Christmas special on this podcast will once again be a very informal chat with Mike the Bite Hill. It's going to be another light-hearted chat over a couple of eggnogs, and we are throwing open the topics of discussion to you, the listeners. So drop me an email with any questions or themes that you'd like us to cover. Nettlecombe Craft School, the website is live. Head on over to nettlecombecraftschool.com. You can see all the courses we've got running there. And currently, up until the 30th of November, there is a competition over on the Instagram page where you can win a free course. So to do that, get to the Instagram, or you get an entry just by signing up for our newsletter on the website. So nettlecombecraftschool.com, or I'll chuck a link in the show notes to the Instagram. We've just added a longbow making weekend, which I cannot wait for. Last time I told you about an ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network talk that I was doing about installing low carbon flooring. It was fantastic to be part of that, alongside a host of excellent presenters, and friend of the podcast, Will Stanix, was there as well. I'll put a link to the recording in the show notes. Have a look at that if that's your thing. Patrons for the podcast, we have one new supporter this week, and that is Sam Goetz. Thank you, Sam. We've actually recorded the first half of a podcast episode together. So look out for that coming some point in either December or January. In the meantime, check out Woven in the Bone on Instagram for an absolute treat. If you find this podcast useful and or entertaining and would like to support us, then head on over to patreon.com/building sustainability. It's quite a lot of hard work and a lot of time to produce this podcast, so it'd be really gratefully received. And you can get yourself 12 hours of bonus chat as a thank you for supporting. That isn't the only way you can support, though. You can, of course, share the podcast on your favourite social media outlet You can leave a little review on Apple Podcasts or give it a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts again. And did you know that there is a Facebook group, Building Sustainability Community, where you can discuss the episodes and say what you liked, say what you didn't, thoughts that come up. For me personally, it's lovely to hear what you thought of the episode, as it is very much a one-way medium. Finally, there is some advertising. I'm afraid that you're going to hear more adverts on this podcast from now on. I tried really hard to keep the podcast advert-free, but for this to be financially sustainable for me, I'm afraid I have to put them on. Hopefully they don't interrupt your listening too much, but I really thank you for understanding. I think that's all the news items. Final bits before we get into the podcast. Cork House is underneath Heathrow flight path, so there are planes rumbling by at relatively regular intervals. I've done my best to filter them out, but apologies if that is distracting. Also, both Matthew and I would say, are partial to a tangent. We both did our very best to keep this conversation on track. But honestly, we zigzag around materials, process, concepts, funding, details. And at the end of this episode, it goes to a place where I really couldn't have predicted. And it was a really surprising and heartfelt turn that caught me quite off guard. So I'm really honoured that Matthew shared that. And I hope you will enjoy that too. So that is it from me. I am back at the end. And remember, there is a whole nother episode with Matthew straight after this one. Enjoy.
I guess across the work and the teaching and the research at the bar, I guess the common thread is what we started calling a sort of whole life approach to architecture and to environmental sustainability in particular. So sort of parallel thread, so what we call the architecture life cycle or the building life cycle sometimes, as a sort of time-based process, and what that means in terms of environmental sustainability at each of those life cycle stages, but also obviously what that means in terms of design decisions at each of those stages and how that contributes to the character, because ultimately my real interest as an architect probably is in architectural character.
Okay.
Probably more, well, not more. Anyway, they run side by side. But if it doesn't end up in something like this, that's compelling spatially and materially,
yeah,
and it's just it's interesting from a sustainability point of view, then I start to lose interest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I can understand that.
Because it's a real, because as an architect, obviously you're interested in making it a real life experience.
Yeah.
It's not an idea, it's not an essay, it's not some writing or a thought, or it's an actual spatial embodied experience is what it really comes down to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. And so we are sat in the Cork House.
Mm.
Is it made entirely of cork? Visually,
visually, I guess that's the sort of starting point. How much of this building could we make in a single plant-based material? In this instance, cork. But obviously, it's combined with other materials, as are all buildings. But yeah. I guess the difference is that obviously buildings are big, complex assemblies of often hundreds, maybe thousands of materials, and even different materials within each of those materials. Mm-hmm. And I think in this case, probably what really drove the project was that starting point about the simplicity of the building envelope, the monolithic, mono nature of the building. How much can we make this building out of only cork? I mean, in the end, obviously, the answer isn't obviously as simple as the question. But
yeah.
So yes, there are steel screw piles. Most lateral load is taken with the timber elements you can see, which are stained black.
Uh-huh.
That's all lateral load, but all vertical load is taken in compression through the cork. the building envelope is cork, blocks of expanded cork, which you can see on the inside is the same as the block you see on the outside. So there's no cavity, no ties, no extra insulation, no breather membranes, no plasters, no renders, no air gaps. It's just big blocks of, as you said earlier, Lego cork.
Yes.
And then as we were, to achieve air tightness on the joints between the blocks, there's the expanding foam air tightness tape, which is a petrochemical product. There's obviously it's glass, Accoya windows and so on, timber floor. But generally, one of the rules was if it's not cork, then can it be timber? And if it's not cork and timber, can it be other plant-based materials? And if it can't be those, and you have to introduce other materials, how are they introduced to the cork and the timber, so that at the end of its life, it can fall apart, as it were, in an elegant way in terms of the material life cycle.
Yeah.
The material life cycles go on across, forever. And the building life cycle tends to be, weirdly, it tends to be around the same length as a human lifetime.
Okay.
On average. I mean, obviously, there are lots of buildings which last longer, and lots which last less than that. And hopefully, obviously, current thinking is that buildings will become a longer lifespan on average. But at the moment, there's no definitive research on it, but let's say it's around 60 to 100 years. I mean, the life cycle assessments are done over 50 to 60 years.
Yeah.
So, buildings are periodic events in the life cycle of materials. So I guess it's just understanding, we're trying to sort of resolve that parallel life cycle story. Materials come together into building, come apart, back into materials, and back into and so on. And obviously that's even more complicated because there are so many different material life cycles within each building, some of which come from renewable resource systems, some of which come from finite resource systems, and they say that the way that the building relates to those earth systems, if you like, that all materials come from, it's complex, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's about the only definitive thing I could say. Christ, it's
to
complicated.
summarise, very complicated.
Yeah. But fascinating, and therefore endlessly fascinating in terms of what that means in terms of architecture and space, and construction and structure. Yeah.
Was this building always going to be cork, or were there? If you were thinking about the close to 100% one material, were there other contenders?
At the time, it was a funny story. I met someone who was thinking along the same lines. Well, he thought of this before I had. We got someone in to look at overcladding using the cork as external wall insulation on the Georgian house,
right,
just over there, as a breathable EWI. And he was an interesting character, one of those funny eccentric types. And he just started talking to me, and I went down to see him in his workshop, and he had this funny wall made of cork and lime mortar. And it was just, I started. Anyway, from there it sort of rolled on. And I tried to include him in the project initially, to work with him to do this, and then it just didn't happen for some reason. Then I ended up going through this whole research route with universities and industry partners and so on. Anyway, to go back to your original question, I told you that would happen. No, it was about cork, right from the outset. I mean, it's a funny material because I'm not sure there is anything else you could do it with. I mean, it has it has limitations in that as the jack of all trades, that you're asking to do all the different functions, so obviously getting a material to perform as structure, which requires a certain density and strength, which is usually pretty counter to what you need from a material for insulation.
Yes.
This is a kind of it just about does each of the requirements that you need just about okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really excel. So obviously that limits it in terms of its applicability. Obviously when we first made the house, we weren't thinking about any of these issues about broader applicability. If I'm honest, really, it was never an idea to sort of challenge the construction industry or anything like that, which is some of the conversations that followed on. At the time, it was a personal interest in simple, solid building envelopes and sort of anti-complexity. Because in the office, I found myself just drawing, just the usual stuff, cavity walls, and just one day just thinking, God, this is just such a load of crap.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons, individually the materials, but then actually when you put it all together, it's just this fairly grim conglomeration of things, an aggregate, and it just didn't feel very good. It didn't feel wholesome's a weird word, but it just even sort of tectonically or tectonically is a bit of a funny word, but what do I mean? Materially, spatially, sculpturally, it doesn't feel like a real thing that you're working with, and that's what I really enjoyed in going through the research stuff, is being in the workshop with the blocks and machining them and the fabric and working with it, and understanding the material that you're making the building with. And then really that's what I was loving. Not working with building products that are all packaged up, and then you're bringing together 25 or 50 different building products. This is really working with essentially two materials.
Yeah.
Materials, not products. Yeah.
Yes, that's interesting, actually, because that's sort of where I have traditionally placed myself in sort of building work. It's working with materials, that might be straw or hemp or timber or cork more recently.
Yeah.
It's transitioned more into a sort of product-based thing, as I'm sort of feeling the need to, I guess, if we're going to save the world, it needs to be accessible to everyone, is sort of the mindset shift. It's all very well building straw bale buildings that are all wibbly wobbly and sort of built by communities and things, but it's sort of the scalability of it is sort of product based, I think.
Obviously, I've been asked lots of questions about scalability. Doesn't interest me really.
Right. Shut that one down.
I don't mean that it isn't important.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it. The more I sort of went off, and you because it hit lots of press and so on, and lots of public interest in it, and so you find yourself obviously quite willingly engaging in those conversations and being led. And then after I don't know what it is now, 4 or 5 years, you sort of come back and you think, actually, was I really interested in that? Or was I just being a good boy answering other people's questions? Yeah. Which I probably was.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about the idea of sort of monolithic buildings since my days doing cob, and that's my sort of entry into monolithic ideas.
That's the core of it.
Yeah,
that is definitely the core of it. It's not actually about Cork, this building, really, for me. Interestingly, it's tectonic architecture. It's actually a stone construction.
Right.
When you look at it, once you go look at it out of house, it's big blocks of thermal stone.
Yeah.
And even the way, this architecture from several thousand years ago has always been delivered in stone. Whether that's, all sorts of places around the world have got this sort of architecture.
You're sort of pointing at the pyramid.
Sorry.
What would you call these? Pyramids?
Corbelled pyramids.
It is. We were talking about hempcrete earlier, and I suppose the structural element of cork makes it a lot more versatile.
I'm not sure it's got a great steel more structural performance than hempcrete.
Oh, really?
I mean, obviously, it probably it's got enough to hold up a single-story house,
Right.
but it does creep. This. So when we built the eaves beam in here, which the windows slot underneath, we had to leave a gap of sort of 35 millimetres there for the structure to creep down.
Oh, interesting. How long did that take?
Most of it happened in the first year. So there's two places which the house ties down to timber structure, there and there. There's six. So these 6 bolts there, the 3 there and the 3 over there, they're what stopped the whole house just flattening
Right,
in
okay.
a gust of wind. But those brackets there that you can't in that beam are slotted connections, so they stop that, but they allow that.
So they, if you were to describe your hand actions, then
So those 6 bolts, they stop sideways movement, any lateral wind load.
yeah,
Which it then transfers that force down back into the foundations, but it's free to move vertically.
I see.
Which allows the creep.
Yeah. And do you know if there's been any more in
There will be more. I mean, I don't know whether this is of any. I don't know, it's just maybe say things like this, but on the big door there, so the most load per square inch of wall, if you like, in plan, is happening on this pier here just behind you.
Yeah.
Because obviously you've got a big opening here, 1.9 metres, and a big opening there. So that's the only place in the house. So this bit of wall here is obviously taking more load per square inch than any other part of the house. So it crept more, and it crept more than the research showed it would.
Ooh.
So when I came to put in this window, it's what happened. I came up nearing the end of the house, everything's in, roof lights on, put the windows in, and I offered it up, and I couldn't get it to go into the gap vertically.
Yeah.
It just hit that ring beam there. I thought, Christ, I've made a mistake. I went back to look at the drawings, dimensions, and obviously it dawned on me in a rather horrible half an hour, as those things tend to unfold. It crept. So I had to go. I got a couple of acro props, jacked up the whole roof on the house using these 2 beams here, jacked it up, and then so in the jamb of the window. So this isn't going to translate very well, but I'll tell you anyway. In the jamb of the windows, there is a machined groove on both sides of all the openings, and then you put a little 4x2 batten which friction fits in, and then you can bolt that window through to that. So each of the windows, you see those 3 bolts
I
there,
see.
and there's 3 bolts on the other side. So all the windows come out with 6 bolts. So it literally would just pop out. So we had to go and beef those up on these 2 openings here to make them 4x4s. So interestingly, those in this part of the house just here with the 2 big openings, that's actually a hybrid structure more in that most of the load is being taken through the cork, but there's a piece of timber which is like a stop gap, a stop post,
Yes.
it just stops it 10 millimetres above the window. So I know it can't creep any more than that in this location here. It may well have crept more in other locations. So that was it. But then that gave us an idea then for, interestingly, for a hybrid. See, it felt like a disaster at the time, and talking to Arabs engineers and on Christ, anyway, it's not a complicated house or structure, so we solved it pretty easily. But that interestingly led to another, that actually maybe 4x4 posts with the stop beam, and then the cork isn't performing completely structurally, and then that takes the fire load off the cork potentially. Anyway, it became an interesting idea for another project we've worked on since this, which was for a big cork and timber warehouse for a German client in Hamburg, in which the timber would be the structural frame. But then the cork becomes just infill, which...
It's interesting because this is the discussion in the straw bale building world. Is you can use the straw bales as the load bearing. There is compression over time, or you can build a timber structure and infill, and people go, we don't want to use timber. It's sort of the stacking functions idea of using one material to do
the sort of Barbara Jones stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's great sort of debates about which one's right.
Yeah, as you say, though, if you want to roll it out, though,
yeah,
I mean, you just got to have that sort of predictability, haven't you? And mainstream, get the warranties and performances known and engineered, and having a nice big squidgy thing that is taking load and moving is a nice idea, but probably limits its applicability in terms of the mainstream. Yeah.
Yes, makes engineers a bit twitchier.
Yeah.
So, I mean, shall we talk cork in more?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think it's wonder material. I've got it's on the inside of my house and on the outside. It's a thermal bridge break for me, and also a cladding. Is sort of how I've used it. But I mean,
when you clad it, how have you clad it?
I screwed it on. Onto a timber frame.
With a gap behind it?
No, directly on.
And what's in between the
What's
in between the timber frame?
So the timber frame with an OSB sheathing, then there's a vapor membrane, then it's the cork.
Okay, so like a breather membrane on the outside of the sheathing.
Yes.
Okay.
You, by all means, tell me if I've made a terrible mistake.
No, I just know that the cork's funny and it's breathable and so on, but there's this always interesting thing, isn't it, of trapping moisture with these materials.
Yeah.
And giving it nowhere to go.
Yes.
I mean, I've got it in one or two places where I've used a breather membrane, and it's always the bits that make me feel the most nervous.
Okay.
In a way.
Yeah.
Just where does it, those breather membranes work when you've got air above them.
Mm-hmm.
As far as my limited understanding of building physics is it works best when there's air moving across the surface of the breather membrane rather than it being...
Right.
Although I have got cases here, again, I probably shouldn't say it, but one or two places where, that is the case. And that always makes me think, I wonder does that really breathe? Yeah.
I hadn't been nervous about that until now.
Yeah, but when if you're an architect or the builder or designer and you're doing these stuff with materials, and you've got to accept that nervousness comes with the territory, haven't you?
Yes.
Partly.
Well, no one else was screwing it to anything. It was all lime bedding sort of mortar
to stop the moisture going in.
Yes.
Like an overcoat. Yeah, I mean that's that has a logic to it. But then again, you lose the...
Not as an overcoat, sorry. Most people were using it as like external wall insulation, where they sort of plaster the house and then squidge the cork into the lime. So it was the fixing was the lime.
Like sort of bedding mortar.
Yes, exactly. And then leaving it exposed. I asked quite a few people if I could screw it on, and they said no. And then I just did it anyway.
Yeah. It'll probably last longer than us.
Yeah, I hope so, yeah.
It's probably not the way to look at one's PI. But anyway, yeah. Oh, God, we're getting all sorts of terrible...
That all began with a question about... we were just going to talk more about cork properties.
As a material?
Yes.
Yeah. Expanded cork, specifically.
Yeah, so why don't we talk, first of all, say what that is?
So expanded cork is a small part of the cork industry. I can't remember what the figures are, but I think it was something like the cork wine stopper industry, which is obviously where the cork originally was grown for commercially, is about, I don't know what it is, it's $250 million or something turnover. And then there's the cork, ACC, ACC is a trade name, Amarin Cork Composites, which is agglomerated cork mixed with a binder. As far as I'm aware, more often than not, that is a polyurethane-based binder. That's the sort of stuff that you see in nice sort of coasters and IKEA.
Is that the floor tiles?
And the floor tiles, which I've got some of those in the bathroom in there. And obviously my dad was an architect, grew up in the 70s, so we had lots of cork tiles in kitchens and bathrooms and so on. So that's agglomerated cork. And that's again probably roughly the same, I think, $250 million or something. And then there's this relatively tiny little industry at the end of the food chain, if you like, in terms of cork, which is expanded cork, or essentially cooked cork, or black cork, they also call it, because when it's cooked, it goes this brown colour with a little bit of charcoal in it. It has a lovely
sort of smoky
smell. And that is a very unusual material for me anyway, in that it's an engineered biogenic material that's bonded in its own juices. So good cork goes into the stoppers mainly, then it gets the remainder gets used in for industrial agglomerated cork, and then any low-grade waste from that, and probably in terms of volume, more importantly, any low-grade waste from the harvest, so lower-grade cork from higher up the tree or on branches that aren't suitable grade of cork for the first two industries, that gets granulated, put into these quite rudimentary pressure cookers, or autoclaves they call them. Which is just a big steel box. Lid comes down on the hydraulic arm. Steam is pumped in. They call it dry steam, which I still don't know what that means.
That's very counterintuitive, isn't it?
So it's about, I think it's something like 360 degrees centigrade, which they say over 90% of which is generated using waste biomass energy to cook. So the steam goes in, the granules expand, and at the same time as they expand, the natural resin in the cork, which is called suberin, which is apparently is a fascinating whole topic of biology of its own, is sort of faintly sort of wonder material.
Right.
Anyway, it's a natural resin that melts. It bonds these expanded granules back together into a kind of quite a dense Rice Krispie cake idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's the closest thing, I think. And then that gets trimmed and cooled down and so on, and made into these blocks, and then they cut it. More often than not, it's cut into sheets of different thicknesses as insulation, internal or external wall insulation. But the basic billet size that comes out of the cooker is 1 meter by 500 millimeters, because that's the size of the pressure cooker.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can get different thicknesses of block depending upon the grade. So the origins of expanded cork, it was originally known as insulating corkboard, ICB. So I'm going to go back one more step there. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good.
So the guy, I think he's called John Smith in America. There's an apocryphal story, which I think, as far as I'm aware, is true. They were using granulated cork in life jackets because obviously it provides buoyancy. And he came into the factory one morning, and some of this cork had fallen into one of the braziers that the factory workers were using to keep warm, and it formed into this big coagulated mass and got all weird and sticky and brown and black. And he thought, well, that's got to be pretty useful for something. So he patented that expanded cork. That was when it was Armstrong Industries, I think, in America.
What sort of era is this?
Late 19th century, 1880 something, 1885 or something. So yeah, so the block size, so I was going on, so the original density is around 115 kilograms a cubic meter. That's insulation grade cork, so quite lightweight, quite aerated, as it were, hence it's good for insulation. And that comes, you can get that in about blocks around, say, 300 thick, maybe a bit more, depending. But then here, and I think the cork you've used in your house, is a product called MD Facade cork. Sorry, this is specifically Amarim now, who are the world's biggest cork manufacturers. About 50% of the market is Amarim. So this MD Facade is about roughly, on average, about 150 kilograms a cubic meter, so a bit denser, which makes it a bit more suitable to use as a building material that's going to be exposed internally or externally, or even used structurally, like we've used it. And that comes in about 220 millimeters thick, maximum is what we get them to give us. So we've used it as blocks rather than sheets. It's probably what I'm coming around to. And so people would normally use it as sheets. So in elevation, it'd be 1 meter by 500 by however thick. We've turned an extra thick sheet or a block on its side. So the wall's 500 millimeters thick by bricks that are a meter long. So in terms of that's the billet size. So the billet size that each of these blocks that you can see is a meter long by 500 thick in terms of the wall, by 220 high. But by the time you've machined it, first of all, to give dimensional accuracy, so you can put the blocks together without glue or mortar, which we'll come to later. By the time you put a tongue and a groove into it, which is the system we were working with at the time, you end up with 180 millimeter high courses by 480 thick, because you shave a bit off the faces, and 960 long. Now the 960 is led by the 480, because if anyone who knows brickwork,
oh yes, of course,
to make that work, and then the offset of the roof here, which is quite wide-ranging, isn't it? The offset of the roof is each time you can see up there, the corbels is 96 millimeters, which you'll see is obviously a subdivision of 480 or 960.
Right. Yeah.
Because obviously, as you're climbing up the roof there in corbels, you've got to course in with the blocks in plan. Yeah, so it's a little 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. So the 180 course height doesn't have any impact on that.
Got you.
In the same way that the brick height doesn't really impact upon the plan dimensions. It's only the plan dimensions really. And obviously, the moment you start corbelling, then you've got to be. Yeah, the corbel has to tie in with those plan dimensions as well. Yeah.
Yes.
So we started off talking about the cork.
I think it's quite easy to talk about the roof when it's just above us.
Yeah, well, in a funny way, that is the sort of key point of the building. Going back to discussing what the life cycle is, that the material and what it's made with and how it's made and how that determines its performance characteristics determines the architecture. You know? These roofs weren't made because I wanted to make pyramidal roofs.
Right.
That's not how it happened. You know, you get the cork, you understand it, find out a bit about it, spend a couple of years doing funny little testy type projects and background research and trying to get grant money and so on. And then once you've understood it, then you start designing the building and you think, well, okay, so the idea here was to make a monolithic, simple building envelope. So that's obviously quite straightforward for the wall. And what if I don't want to introduce another material or another type of structure or form of construction for the roof? So then obviously that leads you to looking back to these ancient corbelled constructions which are all over the world. And that leads to the form and spatiality, not a very good word, of the building. So the point being that the architectural character in use, if you like, in that stage of the life cycle when the building's in use, is deeply connected to going right back into the nature of the material, and how it was cooked, and even into the reason that the trees were grown in the first place for wine stoppers, and then you end up with this little funny sidekick industry, the expanded cork, and then being this pure plant-based material with no other in, which is a rather lovely idea, and then how you work with that, and then the idea then is, as an architect, how do you preserve the lovely characteristics of the material, so that when the building stops being a building, in say 100 years, 200 years, where does it go at the end of its life? How do you then reconnect back with the life cycle of the material? So that then leads you to then not bond the blocks together with glue or mortar. And the whole project being designed for disassembly, which was a whole rigor of its own, obviously. So that is the core of the project. So that then even the whole nature of the architecture again is connected to the life cycle stages after it's been a building in use. So not just before. So that's why I'm getting at earlier on. We were talking about life cycles. This really is a study in architecture and material life cycles.
Yeah.
That's where, for me, it hits the nail pretty successfully on the head. Other ways, I'm very happy to, and I've always been very open about limitations and its lack of scalability, other issues as well, which we talked about. There are lots of technical issues and so on. But if that's the thesis, then on those terms, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
But having said that, I would be disingenuous if I said that thesis was fully formed from day one. It wasn't.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in moving and changing and the way the wind's blowing, and it's a combination, isn't it, of setting a course but then reacting to conditions.
Yes. Yeah. If you just stick to that course.
Yeah, as a sort of like a sort of naval commander. 5,000 people drowned because you didn't want to change course. Yeah. When we started this in 2013, it wasn't. It was nothing like that in terms of a fully formed. That evolved with the building, and the building became a vehicle for me changing who I am, not just as an architect either. Lots of other ways. And it's even been part of it's even driven change in my life and my practice as an architect since it was completed. So it's an interesting, in my lectures that we give, which I give quite a lot of lectures, obviously, as part of being an academic. There's a really nice Elizabeth Gross quote. He writes about Anthropocene and temporality in architecture. And I'm going to mangle the quote, so I won't try and quote it directly, but it talks about that matter and life become undone. They transform and are transformed. So just this lovely idea. The whole reason, in the way that you're an architect, intuitively as an architect, you believe that you transform and build with the material, and in return, obviously, it transforms you. Otherwise, why would you be an architect?
Yeah. Have you? Can I ask if there's an example you can share of how it's changed you, either architecturally or personally?
Well, my whole approach to environmental sustainability, or survivability, as my friend David Grandels likes to call it, or what I started to say is environmental responsibility. I think it's a slightly nicer way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's completely changed my approach to that, and it's been part of formulating a much bigger picture about architecture and materials and life cycles in general. So it's reached out, including other materials apart from cork and where they fit in. Going back to the conversation earlier on when we were talking about finite and renewable resource systems, and actually through working with I work a lot with a colleague called Oliver Wilton at the Bartlett School of Architecture, who was one of the co-designers on this with Dido, my partner at work and life partner, and it's constantly having an impact on how we think, in that it's because we constantly talk about it now. Dido and Oliver's partner, Kasia, they're constantly laughing at us because we just sit there talking rubbish for hours. But it's really important, isn't it, that you've got the object and you talk about it, and in that conversation is where those transformations happen. It doesn't. I'm not just talking about things like when it transforms you in the way that architecturally it transforms you, which obviously living in spaces and the sensory impact of those materials and so on, but also via conversation, talking to and about and around the physical thing, huge shift. Yeah, if I look where I was 10 years ago as an architect.
So, I mean, yeah, where were you 10 years ago as an architect? It was sort of sustainability. That's a sort of
No,
terrible
it
term,
wasn't.
But was that on your radar?
No, not well, a little bit.
Because it's not a particularly, from the impression I get in architecture, is it's not sort of front and centre of education, and you sort of have to want to be a sustainable architect or a conscious architect, perhaps.
Hopefully that's less true as time goes on, but certainly up till now and including now, that is true, yes. Where was I as an architect? So just trying to place where I was really, why I tried, it's a long time ago. So I was never that comfortable in architectural practice, really. I'm quite a physical sort of gorilla. And I like outdoors. Offices aren't outdoors. And I like making. And of course, as life's become increasingly digital, during my lifetime at least, you know, I was still, when I started, had a set square and a T square now on my drawing board. Computers didn't exist, really. So that's missing from the office life, isn't it? So I never particularly found really, I never really sort of thought, I had this weird thing when I came out of college, having been in there for, 5 years and years out, and I never really understood, it never sunk in that I would have to be an architect when I'd finished my architecture, which sounds stupid, obviously. But I sort of emerged out and thought, Christ, actually, I see. That's what I'm supposed to do. For me, it's just been a huge amount of fun. So I'd always been interested in other things as well, like I've done property development. When I say that, I mean my own developments. I did opera set design for Opera North. When I came out, I've made furniture. Always taught. It's never been, apart from being a clueless sort of 20-something coming out and not really having a career plan, which isn't that uncommon.
No.
Also, just doesn't, the office isn't my natural habitat in a way. So then I also maybe part of the reason for that, but is that I then did the kids, by which I mean I'm the one that stepped aside for 10 years or so and did brought up Olive and Jimmy. Obviously, not that Dinah wasn't deeply involved. Of course she was. She was able to do both things. Much better multitasker. So I guess I come to the end of that, 2013. Kids, I don't know, were about 13, 14 and 10, 11. So I guess they're going to secondary school. So I guess I was thinking about, Christ, I've got something to do. Other than just teaching and little bits of architectural work here and there, which I've always done. Obviously, you keep it going, don't you, and work part-time and work with the kids and so on. And my dad was dying at that, so I looked after him for a year. We brought him into Eton here and got him a flat while he was dying of cancer in 2012, something like that. And then that coincided weirdly with the idea for this project and me just not wanting to go back into mainstream practice during those horrible cavity walls I was describing. And I've always been reasonably experimenting and researching. So I sort of developed some of the architectural stuff with him while he was dying, which was nice. He's an architect. And that's where we got on best. Talking about architecture. And I guess, then he died and left me some money. So he'd gone to Ibiza, parents split up, he'd gone to Ibiza, he'd made some money through building a couple of houses out there in his sort of retirement. So he was originally Birmingham City Architect. He ran a big office, several hundred people and so on, and retired early and went and did his thing, had a lovely time, which is just as well, given he pegged out at 70.
Right.
anyway, he left me money, which was really useful for this house, because obviously the research, although the research was funded, obviously this is a private house, and it's not obviously neither legally nor ethically could you take public funds for the house. So it sort of came together like that, really. And then we had this garden in the back, which I didn't know what to do with. And I thought, well, actually, why don't we actually make use of this garden, build a little annex, which could be useful. My mum was living with us at the time in our attic, and I thought, maybe she could move in there. So it's a weird sort of confluence of things, I guess.
Yeah.
Money and motivations and ideas, I guess.
Yeah.
Sort of came together in quite a fortunate moment. And so then I, friend with Oliver at the Bartlett, rang him up one day. We'd done some workshops 20 years before together. He's also a very materially makey kind of guy. And said, I've got this idea for a house made of cork. And we had a laugh and agreed it was a stupid idea, but it sounded fun. So then I did some sort of little small buildings with little small pots of money, seed funding sort of thing. And then eventually it came around to making a larger application. Sorry, there's a woodpecker on the cork tree, I believe.
Yeah.
It's funny, just a funny idea of him trying to peck a squidgy bark. His beak got stuck. Interesting, isn't he? Not making a noise, this one.
Must be a dud.
That's right, it's a dud. Sorry.
That's okay.
Sidetracked. So then I got a grant from Innovate UK with industry partners and EPSRC for the academic partners who were Bath University and UCL. I was an industry partner of the architects, the small architects firm that I was co-director of at the time. And then we also had Nigel Jervis from Team Hour, who you probably know, and Amrim. And on that basis, we got a grant for the research, which is the research was called the Solid Cork Building Envelope. Bit of a mouthful, and it was for the Building Whole Life Performance call, which interestingly really opened out the project. It's interesting, at the time I remember thinking, oh God, I can't squeeze this, because it often happens, you have an idea for a project and you're trying to squeeze it into a research call, which has its own agenda, and you're thinking, does this really match up? And I remember at the time thinking, this doesn't really match up. And then actually that added a huge amount to it. It's really stretching out the idea of the building as a whole life thing.
Yeah.
As I said, I told you the thesis wasn't fully formed, and this is the whole development. Yeah, so we got the funding for that. So then we set about the research, and then the research was always going to feed into this pilot project for this construction system. So the research application made the case for why this was important research. And obviously part of that was that at the end of that was a privately funded pilot project for this prototypical construction system. Yeah, that's about the story, I think. About where I was as an architect. That's the timeline, really. Yeah.
So this has really been a journey then.
Yeah, 10 years. Yeah. And as I say, it's funny that all those facts, when you look back and see how it all fits together, and as you say, your question there, who I was and where I was at the time, just in very plain circumstantial terms, even down to the funding and weirdly, we also, that idea of that buildings live and then they die. So it became, there's a sort of death angle. And then my dad dying at the time, and then there's part of that, there's this weird, when he died, it's this weird thing of, I was halfway through this stuff and thinking these thoughts were developing, and the cradle to cradle model we were doing drawings of that. So when we buried him, I bought a cotton shroud from Shrouds R Us
right
on the internet. and sort of wrapped him up in there. We did a whole home burial thing, you know, took him from where he died in the hospice and brought him back here in a camper van and wrapped him up in the shroud and got 2 planks with these rusty little old nails. And, you know, the idea of what was going to happen to this house when it dies was definitely, you know, not in a weird way, not in a macabre way, but it was the same idea ecologically, that this thing we were burying him in, and he was buried in the forest, you know, in one of those green burial sites, that he would just melt and everything would melt and rot and blah, blah.
Yeah.
And the idea that that's what's happening with this building, if it's a plant-based building, obviously, not quite the same for some of the other parts of the building. Yeah, that was sort of tied into it, you know, the ecological imperative of death as a very, well, as a vital part of connecting the loop, you know, joining the circle.
Yeah.
Whether it's a tree or an human.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was sort of all tied. And then my mum's is a humanist funeral celebrant. So we're quite, again, not in a carve way, but we're quite interested in talking about death in a nice way.
I think that's so healthy.
It's really, for me, it's vital, because obviously my personal view is that culturally it's just taboo.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember at the time when my dad was, the Guardian got in touch about, they wanted to do an article on natural burial sites and things, and green burials, and the journalist asked me to send some photos. I sent some really lovely photographs of my dad lying in state, as it were, in the camper van with my kids brushing his hair the night before the burial, and he came back, we had a big family meal, and some nice photographs, you know. And she wrote back saying, you can't send photographs, you've got to be really careful, you know.
What element was...
Yeah, so I gave up on that, screw you. Well, because people won't find it difficult. I understand, you know, obviously, yeah, it's not going to be the most straightforward thing to talk about always, and you might not want to sometimes, and I guess your mortality, and I don't know, people find it really difficult, but until you come, you know, it's important, isn't it? In a really healthy, life-affirming way is what I'm trying to get to, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be around that.
Yeah.
You know, it's got to be around, you know, if you contemplate those things on a daily basis, then it's got to be done in a really constructive way.
Yeah, you could lose yourself in it otherwise.
Yeah. You know, so my daughter Olive, she's 23, and you know, she does grief workshops, and quite often that it's not just about death, that can be about loss or death of all sorts of things, not death in necessarily a physical sense. But the importance of that, you know, yeah, as a very natural part of, well, not just natural, as a totally imperative part of.
Well, it's the only.
It's stupid, isn't it?
It's the only guaranteed part of life.
Such an obvious thing, and yet it sounds really kind of stupid thing to talk about, isn't it? But then it's interesting. That is true. It's a truism, isn't it? But then it's interesting. If it is, why is it so difficult to talk about? And again, with buildings, you know, why is it such a difficult thing? Well, not a difficult thing. It just never gets talked about. You know, we talk a lot in this office. They're these big immobile objects, aren't they? And they're sort of always there, and they're so static and heavy, and the idea that those do die. You know, there are people obviously write the buildings must die book, and obviously, lots of literature on it, but it's not generally, you know, and yet in our building life cycle assessment methodologies, you know, it's 50 or 60 years, so it is built in to the way that we talk about it, the way that we think about them in those terms. But I certainly never used to think about that when I was designing a nice big new shiny building for someone paying you loads of money to do it. You start talking about, but what about when this building, you know, falls apart? And it's not probably a conversation you're going to have with the client, is it? Yes,
they might start to question whether they've got the right person designing.
I mean, in lectures, often I open up the lecture often with a thing on. Well, first of all, I open up with a lecture with a whole series of slides on Troy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the 9 layers of settlement. You know, the hill ended up being.
It's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay, it's 9 cities. You know, the mythical city of Troy turned out to be real when Schliemann cut his trench through the middle of the hill in Turkey, and it's a hill that ended up about 10 meters of. So it's just 3,000 years of civilizations, the rise and fall of sort of premonition of the Anthropocene sort of idea, and then I lead up from that into John Soane's Bank of England, you know, that lovely watercolor that Gandhi did of the Bank of England, half in construction and half falling apart. You know, and it's amazing to do with a building that's. You know, he spent 45 years of his life designing as this kind of citadel, the British Empire, you know, the most secure building of it, and yet there he is drawing it as a ruin there, and really sort of looking ahead to the sort of, and clearly drawing on historical images from Rome and Pompeii and things, you know, civilizations falling, you know, and, you know, it's so easy to sort of sit there and think that, well, A, you live forever, you know, which is what quite often is a mindset, and B, buildings live forever, and B, civilization live, it's all a bit which is rubbish, you know.
Do you think that's ego-led?
Yeah, it must have a function, mustn't it, biologically? Yeah. You mustn't, the inclination to not envisage one's end too often. Yeah.
Yes, I didn't expect this conversation to go
No.
go that way.
I guess it's great because you've gone back to the root of the thing there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased, by the way.
And it's sort of, when you ask how it changed that, none of the, you know, probably none of that mindset would have developed. Well, not probably, maybe none of that mindset would have developed if I hadn't done the project. So again, you know, it's a constant conversation, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you're open to those conversations with in the design process, you know.
Yeah.
You know, what's it telling me, and what am I trying to do, and what's it doing back to me? And,
Brilliant.
Oh, God knows what it's going to sound like. Yeah.
I don't know how to ask a question after that. It's going to sound very trite.
That weird guy on forecast.
Yeah.
Christ, he's got a few issues. Yeah.
Oh, do you want to say what you told me about the sort of tomb-like?
Yeah. Well, because obviously it does come. There is an iconography of well, it sounds pompous. A typology of sort of death here, isn't there? In terms of it's a very tomb-like structure. The roof. So yeah, there was a joke at the time. You know, when my dad was dying, and you know, was that it's 5 pyramids in a row, and we had this little joke that, you know, that we could put one body in each pyramid as we died. You know, you block it up as you presumably did in the pyramids. Yeah. And who's going to get the pyramid first at the end here?
People bagsying the room they like best.
Yeah. You can't choose, I guess, can you?
No.
That'd be cheating.
Yeah. You get
You take the pyramid that you get. Yeah. So that was Cork.
Yeah.
What a treat that was to listen back to. Thank you so much, Matthew. The next episode is waiting for you with lots more talk about the Cork House, talking about the CNC milling of the blocks, the construction process, and the benefits and limitations of Cork, plus lots more tangents. So do keep listening to go straight into that episode. As per usual, loads of links in the show notes. Do click through if there's anything that you're interested in. That's it. I'm going to end there. I will let you get straight on to part 2. See you in a minute.